Hi everybody, welcome back to English 112 Section 2. This is for our class for Thursday, the 30th of September, where I wanted to talk a little bit about reading and the writing process. That's on page 1663, because I didn't have a chance to discuss that last class, as well as the story of an hour, Rose for Emily, and On a Rose for Emily. So you'll know that we've begun this semester by my and the textbook reviewing some general suggestions for how to go about reading and writing about literature. And on page 1663, there are some more suggestions that might be of use to you, especially as the semester progresses. And on page 1665, it talks a little bit about the importance of taking notes, annotating, and journal note taking. And in fact, at some point at the ending of our short story unit, I'm going to be asking you to write a journal, an informal response to 3 of the short stories that we would have read in the short story section. Most students end up writing about a page or so in response to each of the short stories. So they end up with about a 3-page journal of their thoughts or their questions and their responses. And I'm not giving any particular template or formula on how to go about doing that, but I thought it might be interesting to you to see on page 1665 some of what they talk about in terms of how you can record your impressions is to keep a journal by writing down your reactions to characters, image, language, actions, and other matters in a reading journal. You can often determine why you like or dislike a work, or feel sympathetic or antagonistic to an author, or discover paths into the work that might have eluded you if you hadn't preserved your impressions. Again, this is on page 1665 in my text. Your journal notes and annotations, basically annotations are just notes that you would write, let's say, in the actual text itself, may take whatever form you find useful. Full sentences and grammatical correctness are not essential unless they are to be handed in and your instructor requires that. And I indicated I don't require you to think about grammar or mechanics. I see this as a kind of conversation on paper. Obviously, it'll be very different for paper number 1, though, but we haven't gotten to that point yet. Though you might be able to make better sense of your own reflections if they are following some sort of a grammatical format. But the point is simply to put in writing thoughts that you can retrieve when you need them for class discussion or a writing assignment. And then as this continues on, it gives an example of how you can annotate a text. That's on page 1666. We saw that with Story of an Hour as well, how you could write notes in the margins about things that occur to you as having significance, such as titles or names or symbols. And then how you could go about writing a journal, and that you're writing your own thoughts and reflections. And then how you might even be able to take that journal and choose an element within that journal to create a topic for writing a paper. Not that you have to, but ideally, my hope is that by your writing the journals, eventually that'll give you some clarity in terms of how to proceed with your paper. This is on page 1667. And I am going to be giving suggested paper topics as we continue on in the semester, but they are going to be merely suggestions because you can basically make a determination to create your own paper topic, and as long as I approve that topic, then you can proceed. So you can begin thinking about that. And then on page 1668, it talks a little bit about the thesis, the central idea of a paper. And maybe one of the best ways to develop a thesis, as I myself have suggested in terms of reading literature, is asking the question, why? Once we've determined the what, then asking the question for why. And there are lots of questions then on page 1671 that could be of relevance in either a journal or a paper or just in your own reading. This could be something that you could dog ear, for instance. Some are questions that are based on the form of the work, things like plot, what's happening, character, who are the major individuals in the piece, point of view, who is telling the story, the tone, the feeling associated with the story, the diction, the use of words and language, the images and the symbols. Symbols are basically representational. A symbol is usually something that is concrete that's used to represent something that's abstract. So I oftentimes talk about the idea of a concrete flag being used as a symbol for the abstract idea of patriotism, and so forth. And then you can also ask yourself biographical questions about the author. Are facts about the author's life relevant to your understanding of the work? You can ask yourself psychological questions. What do the characters' emotions and behaviors reveal about their psychological states? Or what do you know about the author's psychology or your own psychology that can help inform your understanding of a text? Or historical questions. How does the work reflect the period in which it was written? And keep in mind that we had talked about some of the ways that basically literary critics go about reading works from an academic formal perspective. So these are many of the questions they would ask. Marxist questions, how are class differences presented? New historical questions, how are social values reflected in the work? Cultural studies questions, what does the work reveal about our culture? A culture being a group of individuals that share behaviors, values, attitudes, and beliefs. So we can go on and on with asking these sorts of questions. We're even told how we could go about organizing a particular paper and then writing a draft, writing an introduction and a conclusion, and ultimately revising and editing. And there's a checklist too as well for you to consider. Is the topic manageable? Is the thesis clear? Is the paper logically organized? Are your arguments persuasive? Does your opening paragraph introduce the topic in an interesting way? Are the paragraphs developed, unified, and coherent? Again, this is on page 1678. Do you have a title that's engaging and suggestive? So the assumption is that you need a title. Is the tone appropriate? And is there a concluding paragraph that gives a sense of closure? You're using transitions between your paragraphs. Are the sentences clear and grammatically correct? Are you using technical terms correctly? Have you been using quotation efficiently and effectively? And you do need to use some quotation in order to support evidence that you are presenting in your paper. Have you followed your instructor's guidelines, and have you proofread? And again, we will be talking about all of these in greater depth when we get a little bit closer to the idea of writing a paper. But I just wanted you to be aware that this was included in your textbook. And when we talk about things like The Story of an Hour, which is a short story that was included in the earlier set of readings that also talked about how to read and write, I wanted us to refer back to that piece and begin to analyze it. Now, The Story of an Hour on page 17 in my text, what we see is an example of annotating the text, where somebody has gone through and in the margins, which is why we've got those big white spaces oftentimes in our textbooks so that we can write notes. In the margins, you can see that an individual has highlighted things that have occurred to them as having some importance. Things like the title and the name of our central character, for instance. That's not to say these are the only things that are important. And in fact, you could take all of these elements that were written in the annotations and write them out on a sheet of paper or in a computer, and that would be very much like what you would experience with, or what you could experience with writing a journal for this class. And if you think about also how subjective literature can be, there can be multiple ways to interpret a piece of literature, and they can be equally valid if we have evidence from the text in order to be able to support that. One of the things that I thought was most interesting on page 18 after Story of an Hour are some of the questions that we are asked about how we might have some bias. But I wanted to go back to that after we've talked about Story of an Hour. And remember that we've talked about things like, before you begin reading, look at the author, because that'll give us a sense of perhaps how we could read it. Look at the date, because that gives us a sense of time period. That's also going to be important. Look at the title and wonder why the author chose that particular title. Look at the language that's used and why is that language used, and look at the ending, which is something that we did with A Sorrowful Woman. And quite interestingly, even though The Story of an Hour was written in the late 1800s, it shares a good number of similarities to A Sorrowful Woman. The author, Kate Chopin. Now, you may already have knowledge about Kate Chopin, but she was a leading feminist writer and is part of that literary canon that we've been discussing, those works considered by scholars and critics worth academic study. And what we get in the story of an hour is basically a life-changing hour. And what we find out is that we have a central character who is told, actually she's misinformed, but she doesn't know that her husband has died. And then she goes off into a room, and rather than grieve, she celebrates. And of course, when she emerges from the room, no one has realized that she has experienced those emotions. So that when it turns out that this was all a terrible error and her husband did not die in an accident, when her husband appears, she's so overcome, and we are told at the beginning of the story that she suffers from heart disease, or actually heart trouble. And there is a difference between heart trouble and heart disease. Then she's supposedly so overwhelmed by shock and grief that she dies of joy that kills. But of course, we know that things are a little bit more complex than that. And at the very beginning of the piece, again, we're told, knowing that Mrs. Mallard was afflicted with a heart trouble. You think about how the heart is oftentimes used as a symbol for emotion. So this is giving us a sense that her heart is troubled, or her emotional state is troubled. Great care was taken to tell her as gently as possible the news of her husband's death. Now, she's referred to as Mrs. Mallard in the beginning of the story. This, I think, is very important, that she's referred to as Mrs., which is a title that denotes marital status. Notice how the same is not true with Mr. We cannot denote someone's marital status based on the title of Mr., which is why Ms. was created, but this would be many years after 1894. Mrs. Mallard, the idea that she's seen as a piece of property of her husband, Mr. Mallard. And notice that we are given Mallard's, her husband's, first name, Brentley Mallard, immediately. The idea that he has individual autonomy in a way that his wife does not, at least until later in the story, because later on we are told what Mrs. Mallard's first name is. And we're also told initially what her sister's name is, Josephine. One assumes that that means that Josephine is single in one way or another and doesn't have a kind of marital connection the way Mrs. Mallard does. But when we think about the idea of both either Josephine or whether it be Mrs. Mallard, we can see that when we are finally given her full name, her first name, Louise, I think there's a similarity with Louise and Josephine in that both of them have roots that are male-centric. Joseph and also Louis. And again, I think that illustrates the idea of what society would have been like in the 1800s, very male-centric, where Mrs. Mallard, when she goes off to her room alone, and even that would have been eyebrow-raising because it was assumed that a woman should be accompanied because of some of the difficulties that could be encountered for female during the time period, or some of the temptations that she might be experiencing during the time period. She stands facing an open window. The idea of window symbolizing freedom, escape, especially because the window is open, and a comfortable, roomy armchair. And she basically sits in an armchair. Again, armchair is supposed to be for one individual, not necessarily shared. So we're getting symbols now about the rebirth and renewal of Mrs. Mallard as an independent being, as a single person. Also, armchairs oftentimes were associated with the patriarch of the family, which is not what Mrs. Mallard is. And she's looking out at an open square at the tops of trees and a new spring life. All of these images are suggestive of the idea of renewal and freedom. The delicious breath of rain was in the air. And while rain could be seen as a negative, it can also be seen as a positive, because rain and water can be cleansing. And it certainly is necessary for life and the continuation of life. And then we find that the notes of a distant song was in the air. Countless sparrows were twittering in the eaves. Now notice Mrs. Mallard's name. It also is a name that is associated with birds. Mallard is a duck. Basically, if you were to look up information about ducks, I think what you would find is that it's a well-suited name for her, because mallards are very common, and one might say that her experience is common, much like a sorrowful woman, even though she's given a name. Also, the idea that mallards aren't necessarily monogamous for life, and we get the idea here that Mrs. Mallard is questioning the idea of whether or not marriage was the only way for her to achieve fulfillment. In other words, it's very similar to a sorrowful woman, but because the time period is so different, in the 1800s, Mrs. Mallard has probably never even allowed herself the opportunity to consider anything outside of marriage until she's become a widow. And in fact, for female during this time period, being a widow would oftentimes mean, assuming that the female had some economic stability, that would mean a certain level of agency and power and control that one wouldn't necessarily have. In fact, the statistics of the time would show that when a female lost a partner, she was much less likely to remarry than when a male lost a partner. And while there could be many reasons as to why, I suspect part of it has to do with the repressive role for female in society. Not allowed to vote, not allowed to hold property, certainly not allowed to divorce. But if she were able to marry and then inherit the wealth, if there were no direct heirs, she could maintain a certain level of dignity. She wouldn't be seen as an old maid that never married, but she would also have a certain level of independence. So there would be less likelihood of her needing to marry. So we're told about, even though there's rain, there are also patches of blue sky. Again, all of this is suggestive of hope and renewal. And in fact, the clouds are going on the west side of the window. Again, if we're given a specific detail, it probably has some significance. So if we weren't told about the west, then we wouldn't necessarily have to talk about the importance of direction. But think about some of the associations with west. For instance, westward expansion and the idea of a new life and hope and renewal. Or the idea of the sun setting in the west, that this could be the ending of an old life for Mrs. Mallard or Louise and the beginning of a new life for Mrs. Mallard. And then we find out that she was young with a fair, calm face, but the lines bespoke repression. And one assumes that one of the reasons why she feels repression is because of the repressive nature of marriage during this time period. We're told in paragraph 9, there's something coming to her and she was waiting for it fearfully. In other words, this is not something that she wants. What was it? She did not know. It was too subtle and elusive to name, but she felt it creeping out of the sky. Think about all of the negative associations with creeping. And now her bosom rose and fell tumultuously, which almost has an erotic hint to it. And one might argue that this is also a beginning for her from an erotic perspective about being able to have other partnerships. She was striving to beat it back with her will. And then she says under her breath, free, free, free. Now, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to say that Mrs. Mallard feels free, especially because we've got quotation that would definitely illustrate that. She did not stop to ask if it were or were not a monstrous joy that held her, that suggestion was trivial, that there isn't a sense of morality that's associated with this, even though we might feel this is appropriate or inappropriate. And we saw something similar with a sorrowful woman, and that certainly we could judge a sorrowful woman, but that wasn't necessarily the author's intent. She knew she'd weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death. This is important because this is a detail that illustrates that her husband is a good man and that he has treated her well. So there isn't any particular reason for her to necessarily be overjoyed over the fact that he's dead, outside of the fact that marriage itself is repressive during this time period. His face never looked save with love upon her. Another important detail on page 16. But she saw beyond that bitter moment a long procession of years to come that would belong to her. Absolutely. And then perhaps my favorite part of this story in paragraph 14, on page 16. There would be no one to live for her during those coming years. She would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women, note that, men and women, believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. Thus far, I've been basically giving you a feminist reading of this text and talking about the idea of repressed female. But this line opens it up to both partners. It opens it up to the institution of marriage, that this is more than just about gender. It's about how marriage can tend to oppress and repress both partners. But of course, the focus, and not surprisingly considering the time period, 1894, and the author, Kate Chopin, a female, was known for writing feminist texts, that the focus is going to be the role of female in marriage. But wouldn't an interesting story be the story of the next hour, where we could get the husband's reaction to what's happening? And we're told that she loved him sometimes. And if anybody's ever experienced the complicated feeling of love, you can know how it's possible to have conflicting feelings. And then she keeps saying, free, body and soul free, great quotations to illustrate that she feels free. And she's thinking about spring days and summer days, again, seasons that are oftentimes associated with renewal and rebirth. She's praying life would be long. It was only yesterday she thought with a shudder that life would be long. Again, that's a piece of evidence to illustrate her feelings of repression. And then she goes downstairs and finds Brentley Mallard, again, he has first and last name, coming in, carrying his grip sack and umbrella. You might even say that he's bringing in the rain as he's bringing in his umbrella. He'd been far from the scene of the accident. He didn't even know there'd been one. And Richards, the family friend who told her about this, tries to shield her, but it's too late. And then when the doctors came, they said she died of heart disease, of joy that kills. And of course, everyone is assuming that she's just so overjoyed at the relief of seeing her husband and so much in shock that she dies. And she did love him sometimes. But we also know, because we were with her in that room when she was alone, that she is going to feel disappointment as well. Now, Richards, he plays a very minor role in this story, and you might be asking yourself, how could he make such a mistake? But the author doesn't want us to ask that question, because if the author did, the author would give us more information about Richards. And we don't get more information. So we assume that it was just an innocent error. You can't attribute anything malevolent to Richards here because we aren't given enough information about Richards. And now that I've talked a little bit about Story of an Hour, I wanted to go back to that page 18 that I was referencing earlier and the questions that follow to show how subjective reading a piece of literature can be. Do you find Mrs. Mallard a sympathetic character? Some readers think she is callous, selfish, unnatural, even monstrous, because she revels in her newly discovered sense of freedom so soon after learning of her husband's presumed death. Others read her as a victim of her inability to control her own life in a repressive, male-dominated society. Is it possible to hold both views simultaneously? Are your views in any way influenced by your being male or female? Does your age affect your perception? What about your social and economic background? Does your nationality, race, or religion in any way shape your attitudes? Do you have particular views about the institution of marriage that inform your assessment of Mrs. Mallard's character? Have other reading experiences, perhaps a familiarity with some of Chopin's other stories, predisposed you one way or another to Mrs. Mallard? So basically, we all have bias, and understanding our influences and bias helps us with our reading. But I would suggest that if a group of newlyweds were to be reading this story, they would probably have a very different sentiment towards Mrs. Mallard than if a group of newly divorced couples were reading this particular story. So this goes to show how ultimately readings can change based on the individuals who are reading, and also can change over the course of our life based on our own circumstances and even our own moods. But remember, the goal is that you need to be able to support whatever position you're taking, and you do that through evidence from the text, whether it be direct quotation or it's paraphrase, that you are stating in your own language elements of the text in order to support your position, which doesn't need to be correct. It doesn't need to be probable. It merely needs to be possible. So I talk about the Story of an Hour not just in terms of reading it from a literary perspective, but also in terms of our foundation of how to go about reading literature. which moves us to the next story for today, A Rose for Emily. This was written by William Faulkner, an author who is also considered by scholars and critics to be worthy of academic study, part of the canon. So you may have heard of Faulkner before. The date in which it was written, because again, you want to begin reading from the very beginning, 1931. And this piece, in many ways, is formulaic, though it doesn't appear to be so on the surface. And the reason why is because of the mixed chronology. If you had difficulty keeping track of what was going on in this particular story, it's because the author wants you to have difficulty keeping track of what's happening and when those events are happening. Because we are not told the story in chronological order. Because if we were told the story in chronological order, we would probably be able to figure out the ending. But if you were surprised by the ending, and actually there are two climaxes in the ending, then Faulkner was effective in being able to trick us. Because basically we're told the story of Miss Emily, who grows up under the thumb, if you will, of a repressive father who doesn't allow her to basically have social relationships or date. And we're also told, by the way, as a side note, that insanity runs in her family. And then it turns out her father dies. And she has great difficulty in being able to accept his death. And in fact, tries to hold on to the corpse in the home for 3 days. Eventually, she's convinced to release the corpse. And then she spends some time alone, and then she comes out into society, and basically now she's free to date because she no longer has her father there as oversight. And the person she chooses, Homer Barron, is quite surprising because she is a Southern aristocrat from the 1800s, so she represents a certain class and a certain status, and she chooses a laborer to date, so obviously he's not of the same class, and also he is a northerner while she is a Southern aristocrat. And basically, as time goes on, there are all kinds of hints and references that he's not going to commit to her. Eventually, we find out that she goes and she visits a druggist and she buys some arsenic. And the druggist asks her why, and she refuses to supply an answer. So the druggist, so intimidated by her, he supplies the answer. And then Homer disappears. And then a terrible smell emanates from her house. And rather than the townspeople confronting her, they cover up the smell with lime. And then she basically becomes a recluse. And then years pass, and eventually she herself dies. And then the town, after attending her funeral, they go into her home, whom no one has entered for many, many years. And they break into a sealed room, and what they find is, well, Homer's corpse. And you might have said, I figured that one out, even though the chronology was mixed up. But they also find in a pillow next to Homer's corpse the indentation of a head and an iron gray hair. And Miss Emily's hair has turned iron gray years after Homer's disappearance. So that indentation of the head was Miss Emily's head on the pillow. And the fact that the hair was iron gray means that she was lying next to that corpse long after it had decayed. And yes, this is a story about necrophilia, but rather than give us specific details, what we are given is basically a very ambiguous ending, or if not an ambiguous ending, a subtle ending, so that we need to supply in the details, and our mind will project something much more horrific than anything that an author could probably supply. Now, this text is written in a kind of form that's known as the Southern Gothic. Gothic is a kind of writing that I myself am interested in. In fact, I even teach a class in Gothic literature. It's the early foundations for horror film and for horror novels. And basically, it was first created in the 1700s, and it followed certain criteria and rules that were basically developed and expanded upon in the 1800s with some very famous texts that you probably have some familiarity with, even though you may not have read them. And these are texts like Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and texts like Frankenstein. And much of it has to do with setting, a eerie and dark setting, a mystery that needs to be solved, possible supernatural elements, death and decay. And again, this was something that was first embraced through European authors, but then as America began to be settled, we have Americans who began writing in this tradition. An author that you might be familiar with, Edgar Allan Poe, would oftentimes use many of these Gothic conventions. And then when you've got somebody like a William Faulkner, they were utilizing these conventions, but it was known as Southern Gothic because they were specifically focusing on Southern society in the United States, and oftentimes talking about the very horrific past of Southern society, its history of slavery and enslavement, and talking about the death and decay and despair that resulted because of that. So we see that embedded within this particular text as well, and the Southern Gothic. But when we read a little bit about Miss Emily and some of her experiences, we can see from the very beginning that we've got a text that very much is written in the Southern Gothic tradition. Now, I also wanted us to read this text because there is an author interview after the fact, and I thought it would be interesting to hear an author's perspective about his own work. But if you want to think about some of the ways that the author responds to his work, I'm not necessarily sure if we would respond in much the same way. So initially, for instance, he's asked about the significance of the title. And William Faulkner gives his explanation about why he called the story Rose for Emily. Now, I've suggested in the notes below that there is imagery associated with roses. For instance, a rose can be thought of as a flower. That's probably the most obvious image. And we can think of Miss Emily as a kind of delicate flower, the Southern aristocrat. But also she has thorns. She's very dangerous because she turns out to be a murderer. Usually roses come with color symbolism. While a rose could be many colors, more often than not, most people think first of the red rose. Red has lots of associations with it. Violence, passion, blood. All of that would work very well for what's happening within the story of A Rose for Emily. The occasion, roses are oftentimes given to mark particular important occasions. Perhaps they're given when romancing an individual, and Rose for Emily is about a romance, albeit a romance gone bad. They're oftentimes given for things like funerals. Rose for Emily begins with a funeral. They're oftentimes given as a way to honor someone. And they're oftentimes kept as mementos. In fact, they're oftentimes dried and preserved. You might say that's exactly what Miss Emily does with Homer. She dries him and she preserves him. Also, rose is a color, which is a mixture of red and white. So one might say that red and white are two extremes, and rose is sort of the midpoint, almost as if what we are talking about in a Rose for Emily is that we are going to get not necessarily only extremes, but some ambiguity about Emily and whether or not she truly is evil or she truly is a victim of society. Perhaps she's a little bit of both. Rose is also the past tense of the word rise. And think about the idea of how the New North is basically rising in power during this particular time and usurping the old Southern way of life. Also, gentlemen in the time would oftentimes rise up when they were in a chair if a Southern aristocratic woman walked in. This is part of a dead past that no longer exists probably in contemporary society, certainly not in the way it did then. And part of Rose for Emily is an investigation of what happens with Emily, who is representational of these old Southern society, when a new society comes in and starts demanding things of her. And yet, when we read something like A Rose for Emily and we read the author's perspective on A Rose for Emily, I'm not so sure if he really addresses any of these possibilities or even gives a satisfactory answer. On page 84, when he's asked, what's the meaning of the title A Rose for Emily, he says, oh, it's simply the poor woman had no life at all. Her father had kept her more or less locked up, and she had a lover who was about to quit her. She just had to murder him. It's just A Rose for Emily. I don't know if I'm terribly satisfied with that particular explanation. So I use this as an example of how an author can perhaps have a perspective that may not necessarily be the only perspective. Now, there could be many reasons why Faulkner responded in the way that he did. You might notice that the interview occurred in 1959, even though the text was written decades earlier. Perhaps his memory is just hazy. Perhaps he doesn't want to give us an answer because he'd rather that we struggle with trying to figure out the title. Or perhaps he's just saying that authors don't necessarily always have embedded meaning within things, even though readers can find embedded meaning within things. Particularly when he's asked further questions, such as, it's been argued that A Rose for Emily is a criticism of the North. Remember, Emily's boyfriend, Homer Barron, represents the New North. And it's been argued that it's a criticism of the South. Remember that Miss Emily could be representational of the old Southern aristocracy. Now, could the story be perhaps classified as a criticism of the times? The interviewer asked. And this is how Faulkner responds. I don't know, because I was simply trying to write about people. The writer uses environment, what he knows. And if there's a symbolism in which the lover represented the North and the woman who murdered him represented the South, I won't say that's not valid and not there. But it was no intention of the writer to say, and notice how Faulkner is talking about himself in the third person at this point. It was no intention of the writer to say, now let's see. I'm going to write a piece in which I will use a symbolism for the North and another symbol for the South. He was simply writing about people, a story which he thought was tragic and true, because it came out of the human heart, the human aspiration, the conflict of conscience with the old Adam. It was not a conflict between North and South so much as between God and Satan. And then the interviewer follows up, and I was glad because I too remember reading this for the first time and wondering, just one more thing. You said it was a conflict between God and Satan. I don't quite understand what you mean. Did one represent and this is Faulkner's response. The conflict was in Miss Emily, that she knew you don't murder people. She'd been trained in that you don't take a lover. You marry, you don't take a lover. She had broken all the laws of her tradition, her background, and she had finally broken the law of God too, which says you do not take a human life. And that ultimately, Faulkner says, this is a ghost story in his mind. And in some ways it is a ghost story because Emily is a ghost of the past, and Emily is haunted by the ghosts of the past as she tries to keep hold of the past. But we see how that really isn't possible throughout this particular story. That we're told that she refuses free postal delivery. Again, this is supposed to be representational of progress, and she doesn't want it. She writes in calligraphy. Again, that's supposed to be representational of the past. She keeps trying to teach China painting lessons, even though the new generation isn't interested in China painting and nobody comes. She has a black servant. This is a replacement for the slave that would have existed in the past. And there is some troublesome use of language here. The N word is used in this particular piece. And what we will see is that it very much is a reflection of its times, as we will see also in other pieces. So I think it's important for us to read that. She doesn't want to pay her taxes, and there's this huge convoluted story about taxes that supposedly her father had owed the town money, her father had loaned the town money, and the town still owed it, and they decided that when the father died, they weren't going to ask Miss Emily to pay. That this was their way of repaying the loan. This is a lie. Basically, even though Emily is from a former rich Southern aristocratic family, when her father dies, they basically find out that the money's gone. She still might have status, but even that is questionable with the new generation. But she certainly doesn't have money. And rather than trying to confront her about that, the town decides to create this convoluted story that she doesn't have to pay taxes. And then the new generation comes in and they say, this is ridiculous. You need to pay your taxes. And she refuses and says, talk to Colonel Sartoris, which is particularly relevant because he was the one who came up with the idea. But when she says, talk to Colonel Sartoris, he's already been dead for quite a while, sort of illustrating how difficult it is for her to accept a dead past. And some of the language that we will be talking about next class, it's some of the language is going to seem a little bit archaic, but remember during the time that it was written in. I can say, though, when we're told that Homer was a northern laborer who liked men, that's less about his sexual orientation and probably more about the idea that he just didn't want to commit to her. But regardless of what his sexual orientation may or may not have been, the reality is that he had a relationship with Emily, and we assume that she killed him because he wouldn't commit to her. That decaying house is much like her decaying life. So next class, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the quotation in Rose for Emily and the use of the we narrator, which is the community. And then we can move forward with our next pieces. You can see that I've got 3 short stories at this particular point for you to examine, or for us to examine as we continue on with our short story unit. And I'll talk more about journals and upcoming assignments as well. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And for today's attendance question, which will be due on Friday, October 1st by 10 a.m., which of the 2 stories discussed today did you prefer and why? The Story of an Hour or Rose for Emily? And we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.